The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to be talking about Taiwan-China relations. And to help us do that, we have two great guests. One is first Raymond Kuo, who is a former professor at Fordham and now at the Rand Corporation running their Taiwan initiative. Raymond, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And also we have our old friend, Professor Robert Koepp. Rob runs the Asia Pacific Initiative at Chapman University and is a professor at the Chapman Arduous College of Business and Economics. Rob, welcome.
Thank you, Marshall. Glad to be here.
Well, I'd like to kick things off with a question that's probably on everybody's mind, which is, if you look at the popular press, Taiwan and China are facing off, armed to the teeth, across the Taiwan Strait, ready to go at it with each other. How far from the truth is that? Raymond, start us off.
Sure. I was in Taiwan for the election last month and doing interviews with both local and international journalists. And the international journalists always ask me, like, so is this election going to lead us to World War III? And I was like, no, of course not. Like, if you ask people on the ground there, they actually weren't that concerned about the security situation. So my usual response to them was like, if there's any election that's going to lead us into World War III, it's the U.S. one at the end of the year, not the Taiwan one. I think there is obviously a reason to be concerned, right? The Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint for a U.S.-China conflict. But I think we have to remember that overall the likelihood of war is quite low historically, and all sides have a really strong interest to not want to get into a war. Now, that said, if you're Taiwan, you're in the weakest of this sort of triangle. It really is imperative for Taiwan to be arming itself more in order to push back against not just Chinese conventional coercion, but also especially gray zone coercion. And so if there's a risk of conflict, for me, it's really in that gray zone where China, for example, tries to impose a quarantine or a blockade on Taiwan, or tries to steadily close its international space such that Taiwan doesn't feel like it has any other choice but to kind of try to internationalize the dispute and draw in the United States even further. But to get back to your basic question, no, I don't think the people in Taiwan, or to some extent the people in China, really are going for a war at this point.
Well, and Rob, it's funny because you and I landed in Taiwan.
We did indeed.
The day of the election.
Yeah.
So what's your sense of all of this?
Well, I agree with Raymond. I don't think it's actually that likely. At the same time, the age-old adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. And to Raymond's point, exactly, Taiwan needs to be doing more towards its defense. There's this, it's interesting. There are a couple of debates in Taiwan that I think get overlooked in the United States and in the West, maybe almost outside of Taiwan generally. So one is there's this really raucous debate about what Taiwan should do. So we saw that, in fact, getting back to your point about the election. So how did the election go? Well, the least favored candidate for Beijing won, Lai Ching-te, the DPP. That's a continuation of Tsai Ing-wen's generally considered pro-independence party. At the same time, the first time in 3 election cycles, the majority of the votes went to 2 groups. It was a split vote, but they went to 2 groups that favor more amicable relations across the Taiwan Strait. So that's, to me, the bigger take home. It isn't who won by a relative majority. It's what the people are thinking, which, by the way, the spoiler candidate's a bit like a Bernie Sanders. So he's, we have lots of discussion about that if you want. But in any case, it's not really clear if it's not so much a pro mainland stance as much as, hey, let's lower the tension. So that is the consensus view, certainly. And even the DPP, which is now in power in the executive branch, they aren't talking like they were a few years ago when China was a lot poorer and a lot less militarized, to say, hey, let's go our own way. Everyone's talking along the lines of, let's try to work things out. So I think that's, where you have to start seeing the issue. And it's the Western press, I think, likes to see, hey, here's a conflict point, and it's understandable. And it's good to have the scrutiny, and it shouldn't be ignored, the possibility. But the likelihood, just as Raymond was saying, you really don't see an interest in heading in that direction, and there isn't an economic interest at all.
Well, and let's talk about that economic interest, because I think underlying all of this attitude of kind of let's keep things going, let's not fan the flames too much on the Taiwan side, is a very deep set of economic and business relationships. I'm not sure people really appreciate that. Tell us a little bit more about that.
And I also just want to add, in the context of the China now having far less foreign investment, I assume foreign investment into Taiwan is continuing.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, a lot of China has steadily over the last few years been imposing economic sanctions or cutting back on the free trade agreement essentially it's signed with Taiwan, the ECFA, under the Ma Ying-jeou administration. But the important thing to note is that they're reimposing those tariffs on agricultural products. They're not imposing those or reimposing those on semiconductors. And the reason why is that about 35-40% of Taiwan's trade, I believe, is with the mainland, and the vast majority of that by value as well is semiconductors. It's intermediary goods. The Chinese rely upon the stuff that Taiwan manufactures in order for it to do like its high-tech industry and high-tech manufacturing. So those intermediary goods, I think, are a pretty important one important factor for preventing conflict across the strait. I think there's two things I would actually mention in terms of saying that this may not be as rosy a picture as we might think. One, Taiwan is actively diversifying its trade relations with especially Southeast Asia, but also, we're seeing negotiations happening right now with the United States. I think this is good from a security perspective. China has very clearly shown to South Korea, Australia, to Taiwan itself, that's willing to use economic coercion to get their way. And so diversifying is probably a good thing. But Dale Copeland, who I don't remember where he's a professor somewhere, he just had this great new book on economic statecraft by great powers. And his argument for the longest time is that it's not trade specifically that reduces conflict between two states. It's trade expectations. If I believe that in the future we will continue to trade more, then I have a reason not to want to fight. But if I think that I've hit the high point of our trade and it's time and it's only downhill from here, then I might actually want to fight you. I have less, the shadow of the future matters less if I think our relations are going downhill. And so, there are good reasons for Taiwan to want to diversify, in part, mostly because of Chinese coercion. But that actually might perversely give China a greater incentive to actually ignore the economic benefits of the trade and actually want to go for a conflict.
Yeah, Rob, what's your sense on that? Is beyond trade, there's so much investment and so much intermingling of both Chinese and Taiwanese IP and know-how in how to manufacture. Taiwanese companies are hiring tons of Chinese workers to be able to run the factories. This strikes me as just a tremendously deep set of relationships. How is it even possible that might get undone?
Well, in terms of what the current administration in Beijing is looking at is this revival of Chinese greatness. So with that in mind, fully laying claim to Taiwan, it's never not claimed, of course, Taiwan, but the difference being it's just like it was discovered with Hong Kong. Hong Kong's an interesting parallel because you had even more, right, integration there. You had even more Chinese who had moved, who were working in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of the Chinese mainland. I mean, it's a little, it's a blip. Yeah, right. It's a peninsula and an island right off the mainland there. So, it had already been part of China. Historically, even as a colony, it was just, partially occupied. In fact, China refuses to acknowledge it was ever actually a colony. And even with that integration, it insisted on going further. So the problem is, to your question, Marshall, even with all that, there's, in Chinese, there's this statement, and it applies so much to all factors of life, interpersonal relationships, businesses, and in this case, I think definitely the administration of Xi Jinping, and that is, they call it 安全感, or more often it's 缺安全感, which means to lack a sense of security or lack, this sense of safety. And so what happened in Hong Kong, of course, 2020, they passed the national security law. Now, granted, that had been part of the handover agreement with Britain, but I mean, basically things were working pretty well in Hong Kong, except you had people protesting, and it didn't look nice in the eyes of Beijing. So they decided to impose national security law, take away the opposition. Absolutely, they've now put out bounties on dissidents who have gone abroad. Jimmy Lai, the famous publisher of Apple Daily, is in jail.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Okay. So, they've done all this kind of following the objective of making China great again. And Hong Kong has just imploded. In fact, if you just compare stock markets, Shanghai is flat. Hong Kong is down like some 40%. And it's in fact Taiwan and the US that are up 40% opposite. I think that's over a period of about 5 years. But it's like, it is so clear. And that's just one of many illustrations. So you have this sense of nationalistic pride that overrides economic considerations. But I'm also hoping that, at the end of the day, what's going to happen is it's going to be enough sober thinking about, just to Raymond's point, you have this sort of decoupling as it's more, you can call it diversification, which that's part of what this strategy is, but it's decoupling, de-risking, doesn't matter what you call it, but this, disentanglement between, say, Taiwan and the mainland. Yes, it provides, perversely, while it's safer on one side, it invites the possibility of aggression on the other. Nevertheless, I like to think, if China's taking notes, which hopefully they are, or if not, Xi doesn't take notes, his inner circle does. Hong Kong plus Ukraine should really be valuable lessons. That it's not worth it, but I think it's true that at the same time we have to be mindful as that disentanglement occurs. Yes, the risks increase. At the same time, business continues, and there is a lot of interactivity.
And as the Chinese economy continues to decline and stagnate.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that the political calculus behind taking people's eyes off of the problems domestically becomes kind of an attractive alternative for
yes.
Xi.
I consider it the Falkland scenario, right? I mean, why were the Falkland Islands invaded by Argentina? Well, the economy's bad. Britain's far away. Let's give it a try. And that didn't end well for the junta in Argentina. And again, this is where I hope historically, and if there's any population that's deeply historical, it's the Chinese, and that goes across both sides of the Taiwan Strait. I hope there's some lesson learning going on.
But I was just particularly interested in the whole issue of semiconductors. I mean, how do the U.S. restrictions on semiconductors against China influence the Taiwan-China trade?
Raymond, you want to start with that?
Sure. Ooh, that's a good question. It's an area where I think that the U.S. in particular doesn't do a good enough job. We don't do economic statecraft very well, right? We don't really have economic or like foreign economic policy. And so I remember it was as Raymonda was talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU said to her, like, hey, like, what did you, like, this is a massive subsidy to the U.S. electrical vehicle industry. Like, what did you, like, this is terrible for us. And her response was like, well, frankly, we kind of forgot you were there. Like, this is the largest market in the entire world. And you forgot that they were there? Like, come on, we got to do better than that.
Yeah, and we wonder why we don't do well with economic statecraft.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
And so I think this does put, Taiwanese companies in a bit of a bind, right? Like, if they're not able to sell the most advanced chips to China, well, okay. I mean, I think it makes a certain degree of sense from a national level, maybe not so much on the company level, but fine. If you're going to have to pull back from the market, you have to pull back from the market. But then there needs to be a compensatory market as well. And, with the 21st century trade negotiations with the United States, maybe that will be a market. But, one thing I think that's clear from IPEF in particular is that the U.S. is not interested in market access for Asian countries, and that's pretty much what those countries want. So it's really hard for us to go and say, look, you shouldn't trust the Chinese. You should be engaging more with the United States. And they say, okay, then lower your tariffs and let us in. And we say, oh yeah, but not that. It's a politically difficult for any Asian leader to sell that back at home, and that's exactly what they want. So we're just kind of behind. We're very much behind the ball on this one.
Well, so how is all of this playing out regionally within East Asia? It seems to me that now we have new alliances that are happening. China's looking to probably diversify its source of supply from Taiwan. Taiwan is looking to diversify its markets. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What's really going on here?
And maybe also to deal with the issue of Japan, which is an enormous economy and a former colonial overlord of Taiwan.
And China.
So, the Taiwanese are really, like, in general, kind of okay with the colonial history. I shouldn't say like okay, but like there's a much kinder feeling towards Japan than there is towards China.
Well, that contrasts with other,
like Korea.
Korea, or the Philippines, or even Vietnam for that matter. But he's right. I mean, well, of course, part of that was Japan colonized Taiwan under an agreement. I mean, the Qing dynasty had to give it over in 1895, and Japan wanted to make that, before it really started launching this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, it was going to be a showcase of how it could work. So it was much more hands-off. It's not to say the Taiwanese were all fine with that. There were guerrilla resistance movements. There was, execution of Taiwan freedom fighters and so forth. But in general, I mean, they bought over the elites by and large. And there was a much more of a Taiwanese leaning towards Japan identity, with the elite educated in Japanese, that separated it from connectivity with the mainland for 50 years. So that does add into this mix. And it also encourages, to the point just made, an interest in Taiwan that's above just that of a regional power or player for, say, Japan, because Japan feels it has a deeper bond to Taiwan than it does other countries in the region.
But we were talking about kind of diversification of supply chain, diversification of markets. Is Japan playing a big part in that, or is it other countries in the region that are where there's more activity?
I can say something to that. I mean, just the case of, I think two companies are interesting in this regard, Foxconn and TSMC, right? And they both are really emblematic of Taiwan's high-tech industry. So Foxconn has made its entire fortune in mainland China, right? So all our iPhones are made by Foxconn up until recently, all in mainland China. Now, Foxconn itself, which is of the the Taiwanese business community that's pro, hey, let's get along with China, this is good for all of us. It's definitely Foxconn. Yet they've started opening operations in India. They've seen the wisdom of diversification. TSMC is not only building facilities in Arizona now, partially at the urging of the Biden administration, but also out of enlightened self-interest, friendshoring, nearshoring. In this case, actual ironically kind of reshoring. I mean, TSMC was founded by Morris Chang, who was at Texas Instruments originally, and he got all his training there, and then took it to Taiwan and built up what he built. But I was going to say the other place they've expanded to is Japan, with subsidies from the Japanese government. So there's going to be TSMC operations in Japan, in the United States. Foxconn is getting out of China. I mean, the whole thing is really just sort of metamorphosing in a way. And you see this across the board. Chinese businesses, mainland Chinese businesses on their own have decided, look, I can't, handle these tariffs. I'm going to set up shop in Vietnam, in Cambodia. Southeast Asia is the typical go-to place. So it's happening. I mean, there's this great kind of migration of the workshop of the world that China used to lay claim to, really has begun spreading out in a way that the Chinese government doesn't want but can't avoid.
Yeah. I had Mexico is also another.
I was going to mention Mexico.
Yeah, that Taiwan's diversifying. I was chatting with James Wong, who's at TITRA, the kind of the trade promotion agency within Taiwan, and he had a really interesting viewpoint, which is that as China globalized, Taiwan became more China-fied, if I can use
Yeah.
bad language here, right? As China, like, in the especially after W2 accession, when it was like going out and exporting and kind of conquering the world, well, a lot of Taiwanese industries, just like Foxconn, went over to China to set up their operations and kind of flowed in through their supply chains, flowed in through their development system. But now, as China is retreating from globalization to some extent, if we can call it that way, or we're seeing delinking or de-risking, it's Taiwan's turn to globalize. So you're
Yeah.
seeing this turn towards Southeast Asia, towards Japan, towards Mexico, and of course the United States, in part because we're seeing that dynamic of like, well, we can't really, economic development will not necessarily happen by hooking our train to the Chinese, so we've got to go out there on our own and figure other things out.
Yeah, and so what does this actually mean for the United States in terms of both the security side of the equation and the economic side of it?
Well, I'm skeptical that, say, TSMC is actually going to, in Arizona, will actually be successful. I mean, it's not a technology thing that lets TSMC do, like, that has led to its being a juggernaut. It's the fact that they run 3 shifts of PhDs and master's people a day, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the machine breaks down at 5 p.m. At 5:01, you can send somebody out to go fix it. Not like 9 a.m. the next day. You're running shifts constantly. It's a matter, and I can't imagine that Arizona or U.S. labor laws are going to allow that to happen. But I mean, I think in terms of the broader sort of economic conversation that the United States is having with Taiwan right now is helpful. It's the one country I could potentially imagine where you would have a free trade agreement being signed, Taiwan and the United States. And I think beyond that, it's the need to give the Taiwanese government, economy, people, whatever you want to say, an alternative to being wedded to the Chinese market. And the more you can provide that alternative, the easier the greater that diversification becomes, and the less susceptible Taiwan is to gray zone coercion specifically. Military side, we haven't touched much on that just now. I'll just say, yes, Taiwan needs to do more, but I think it's got strong support in Congress. Both the United States and Taiwan are interested in Taiwanese defense. I think the question is exactly how that defense is structured, and we can get into more of that later on.
Yeah. Well, and Rob, I'd love your perspective on this, because I know you're looking in at the moment. You're doing a lot of research on kind of the military longer term strategy here, and so what's your sense of the security and military side of this vis-a-vis the U.S.?
So, I think a big part of the equation there in terms of sustainable security is I'm very happy to say, Admiral Lee Ximing, who he was the chairman of the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for Taiwan. He was also Minister of Defense. And he has promoted something called the overall defense concept, which if you actually look at movements within the Pentagon, they're in sync with this, which the idea of an overall defense concept is you need to stop looking at defense as, how many ships do I have, which, by the way, China now has the most, right? Fortunately, I mean, in terms of U.S. Deepwater Navy, they're mainly littoral, so they're kind of shore, aligned ships. But nevertheless, I mean, China's militarization is enormous. But that's the whole point. It's asymmetric warfare. So instead of focusing on quantity, you want to focus on quality. And you want to move away from a policy of first strike or aggression towards one of defense. So if Taiwan is more proactive in saying, look, we want to do everything we can to defend ourselves. Stop trying to think, can we beat China? You can't beat China, but you could scare it away, is how I would summarize that. So if Taiwan focuses more on things like drones, denial of access, basically, which is what the Pentagon has had to increasingly look at. I mean, the days are gone when
this is a Middle East military theme at the moment.
Well, there you go.
Well, so, the Ukraine.
Indeed. And so that's kind of how the nature of warcraft has shifted. And we've learned really painful lessons. We keep learning it, right? It's like we learned the lessons of Vietnam. It's like, a nation that doesn't want to be occupied won't be occupied. Well, that happened. Not to say that the regime that came in place, although it toppled a corrupt U.S. client state, it was no walk in the park. And so that's how we had the boat people and we have little Saigon here. I mean, it's very tragic what happens when a great power that's trying to do things the right way ends up not understanding what it's like to deal with a nationalistic movement. But then we saw it again in Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia is now experiencing it in Ukraine and so forth. So Taiwan can do quite a lot but it's important to signal and it's important to show we're not going to try to match you with big aircraft and big ships. Instead, we're going to make it so you won't have an easy time here. And that's how we'll defeat you. It'll just be so costly, you'll have to pull out. Just like the greatest military and still surviving economy the U.S. has learned, China is much more precarious. Getting back to some of our earlier topics, China does not have a robust economy. It is really on a lot of very flimsy foundations. And China's going to have to do a lot of retrenchment to improve itself going forward. So if it added on top of that a war, the U.S. can survive Vietnam, and it did. It can survive a pull out of Afghanistan. Maybe the Biden administration won't, but the U.S. economy and nation can. China, under the CCP, cannot if it has a serious conflict that it does not clearly win and deliver results to the people who are already protesting because of everything from an imploding housing market to lack of jobs for youth and lack of payment for laborers.
And I assume for them, the movement of Taiwanese businesses to other countries must be a blow to younger Chinese in particular.
Absolutely. China, it's just beginning to dawn, I think, on the policymakers in Beijing how much they've lost. Really, and it's interesting. It coincided very much with COVID, which was like their last claim to greatness. If you look at the early propaganda that came out of COVID, it's like they actually had a headline that a number of, I'm sure Raymond saw it too, a number of us China watchers paid attention to, was saying the world should thank China for how it's responded to COVID.
And for giving it to us too.
Exactly, no. But they honestly thought they had the model, cracked.
Right.
And it was like, we are the future. And she still believes that, but it's impossible to imagine that in economic and industry planning circles, and hopefully some of the more rational political planners, that they see the way things are working as something that's sustainable. I mean, it's really standing on crumbling foundations. So the point being, if it were to add to that any sort of military conflict, I mean, and by the way, it goes beyond Taiwan. How about the Himalayas with India? It still hasn't resolved that. If Uzbekistan decides to support its brethren Uyghurs, which the Uzbek and Uyghurs are indistinguishable linguistically and ethnically, on and on and on. I mean, China's got a lot on its hands. It honestly, if it thinks about it, does not want to see a conflict in Taiwan. But I'd be curious on Raymond's takes.
Raymond, let's hear your perspective on that.
Sure. No, I mean, I think that's all spot on. I mean, the good news is that Taiwan is doing a lot more for its own defense within, say, the last. It could have done it sooner. Would have been nice if the progress we've seen in the last, say, 4 years had been, say, the last 20 years. But sure, fair enough. We live in the world we live in. I think Taiwan is on track to have 5,000 drones by the middle of this year, or maybe next year, military drones. And I think they are currently producing like 200 to 400 anti-ship missiles a year of their own indigenous design. And so I think, there's a lot of asymmetric armament that Taiwan is doing. I think there are two elements here that I think could use more addressing. One is the software side. I don't mean in terms of computer programming, I mean in terms of social organization. Do people know where to go if the missiles start falling? Do they have roles? Can the governments, take the great healthcare system they have over there and then put it onto a wartime footing to support combat troops or to support social resilience and, getting people to the hospitals when they need to go? That's one thing. The other thing is I tend to be a little bit more wishy-washy, and this is intentionally so, about like, should Taiwan go fully asymmetric versus not? Part of the reason why is that, I think the advocates for asymmetry are absolutely correct. Like, if you want to blunt an invasion, this is the best way to do it. But that's not the only challenge that China poses to Taiwan. Within the last week, we've seen the boats, the kind of two people died. There were two Chinese people died when they tried to run away from a Taiwanese Coast Guard off the coast of Jinmen, which is right there. And in response, the Chinese have started to the Chinese Coast Guard boarded a tourist boat from Taiwan. And so that's a sort of capability that you don't want to, hit a Chinese Coast Guard boat with an anti-ship missile. You want to have your own Coast Guard boat and say, hey, knock it off. That's not okay. And so I do think there is some scope for symmetric defense or symmetric capabilities. But quite honestly, I really haven't come down either way. I'm still kind of working through the whole thing myself.
Well, but the vulnerability side, which is really Rob's point, right? Your point is that the internal vulnerabilities of the Chinese economy and Chinese really kind of tenuous social order pose too much of a threat to risk rocking the boat on some fanciful external foreign adventure.
An area where economics and military strategy and business strategy overlap is signaling. And I think what really has to be achieved is Taiwan, we never have to convince people like Putin or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un for that matter. What you need to convince is enough of the inner circle. Because those are the people who, they're not in as much of a cocoon, right? Their whole survivability is dependent on not only the big guy in charge allowing them to live another day, but the prospect that if the big guy, goes away, either through natural causes or whatever it happens to be, that they're not exposed. And the last thing they want is a situation that they can't control, because these megalomaniacs, they expect the minions to take care of all this, right? So that's where you can leverage. And if you can signal to them simply the possibility, enough of the possibility that this will not turn out well for you, your future and the future of your people who will turn on you is not assured if you try this adventurism, then you can succeed. And to also just concede a point that Raymond made, and my, Admiral Lee might disagree with me in some regards. I need to have a few more discussions with him on this, but I think there's a way to balance out the asymmetry with the symmetry, because it's sometimes made the observation in political circles in Taiwan. It's like, but we have to show the people we're doing something, right? They want to see a nice big, submarine, which Taiwan has also been developing, right? So you kind of have to. I even think of our former president, wanting to do, after he visited, he saw the Gaullist approach to nationalism and a big military parade, right? He liked the French military parades. He thought, hey, I want one of those in Washington. Well, you sometimes need that stuff. I mean, not that I am in any way giving a point to that person, but to say that sometimes the public needs to feel reassured, and they like to see big, fancy things, which is one of the things North Korea does quite well, right? With the parading of the rockets and so forth. So you can balance it in any case, but your core military strategy has to be something that's sustainable. And so anyway, I think that's where Taiwan can win what it wants to win, which is deterrence. Right. Forget winning a war. All you want to do is stop a war. That's your victory.
So I was just curious, as if I'm sitting in Taiwan, I'm looking at the Ukraine situation. What are the lessons from Ukraine for both China and for Taiwan?
Well, I've got some thoughts. I'd be interested in Raymond.
The U.S. won't show up. I mean, I think that's the biggest takeaway in Taiwan. They actually did a nice before and after poll. It happened to be a Taiwanese firm did a poll just before the start of the war, and it was something like 50% of Taiwanese thought that the U.S. would show up, and like 30% would fight to defend Taiwan. And then the war happens, and those numbers flip. They think that only 30% think that the United States would actually show up, and like a huge, like 55% think like, okay, we're going to fight for Taiwan. The main take, and it's hard to argue with that. I mean, we in the United States, we're helping Ukraine, we're helping them fight. I mean, maybe not so much Congress right now, but let's leave that aside. We think we're doing a lot. The Taiwanese look at the exact same situation and say, you didn't send troops. you didn't actually want to defend a small country. Why should we think that you're going to defend us? There's this it's called 以美论 in Chinese. It's like American skepticism, essentially, right? And it's this constant debate that the Chinese intentionally try to kind of exacerbate as well. Like, will the U.S. actually show up? Should we actually be skeptical of the United States? And the takeaway from Ukraine was like, yeah, we should.
Yeah.
So,
what's your sense on that?
Yeah, no, I think Raymond's absolutely correct in terms of Taiwanese public opinion, which sometimes I find a bit consternating myself, just because, for one, Ukraine does not have something called the Ukraine Defense Act. But that's what we have. Congress passed the Taiwan Defense Act. So, it's not a like-for-like comparison.
We are obligated.
We are, well, and we're the 以美论, as Raymond aptly points out, and that is a prevalent point of argument in Taiwan, which means, it literally translates as doubt America theory, right? So in the doubt America theory, by the way, goes back to the early days of the KMT, when we had basically written them off with the Dixie Commission, right? When we start, Edward Snow and Red Star over China. I mean, we under FDR, there was a lot of doubt about the future of China under the KMT, which has successfully ruled until it decided to democratize Taiwan, ironically. But in any case, so that point of skepticism about America, I would say this, back to the point we were just discussing, that's actually a prudent strategy for Taiwan. Go ahead, assume you're on your own. Ukraine would have done better if it had started with that premise as well. So Ukraine was not a member of NATO, although Russia tries to portray this as a NATO versus Russia war. It had not taken seriously the threats that the CIA and others were constantly feeding it information on seriously. It had already kind of given up a big chunk of its eastern border. Crimea had been lost, right? I mean, it was kind of muddling through things, and then it had to get serious when the Russians did. Taiwan would be much better advised to just say, look, if you're going to doubt America, doubt it. What would you do?
Be prepared.
Be prepared. I mean, I think there's a kind of conceit in Taiwan. It's like, well, and you hear this from Ma Ying-jeou famously, right? The last KMT president of Taiwan, where he's basically said, in public, well, China's, the military is so big, forget it. It's like, I mean, it is worse than Neville Chamberlain kind of defeatism. Yeah. And it's strange that he's, a recent leader, and the KMT still has a following with that kind of, prominent figure speaking on its behalf. But I would say, look, I can't imagine the Taiwanese actually being okay with life under the CCP. I mean, it's just inconceivable to me. And I think that would be maybe the wake-up call. You don't want it to be too late like it was in Ukraine almost. But if the Taiwanese can start preparing for, look, what are we going to do to make this work? And it is possible, but it requires a radically realigned strategy where you don't hope America will come to your defense. Now, I actually think, and I would be interested in Raymond's take, but I think given the political realities, not only in the U.S., but also Japan, Korea, ASEAN, you have to throw in the Quad, which is, India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. And then you also have to look at something like AUKUS, which is, a nuclear deterrence with nuclear submarines between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. I mean, there is, a lot at stake for more than the U.S., in a way that Europe should be more involved, and it hasn't been. I mean, they finally got Orban to capitulate from Hungary and allow some aid to go to Ukraine. But I mean, if anyone should have really been right there for Ukraine immediately, it's not a NATO member. It should have been Brussels more than Washington. But in the case of Taiwan, I think along with the Taiwan Defense Act, it has a lot more cards to play than Ukraine ever did. And also it relates to what we were just talking about with the supply chains. There are so many vested interests that Taiwan remain intact that I actually think the 以美论, this doubt America theory, is moot in a way, because it doesn't matter. If Taiwan can get serious about its own defense, and two, if you actually see the various ways that multiple countries will find a way to support Taiwan, I think it could last it out much longer than they're assuming, but it takes a new way of thinking about defense.
So just to sort of wrap everything up, what is, you think, the most likely scenario for the next 5 years in terms of Taiwan, China, and the U.S.?
I'll again defer to Raymond to take it first.
Well, actually, just to respond to a couple of your points there, I think that
Please.
all very well said. I think the issue for me is that I published a piece on this in Foreign Policy last year and then War on the Rocks the year before about the fact that, we in the United States often forget that small states have more options than we suspect.
Yeah.
So the question is not, I agree with you that, like, I think it's very unlikely that the Taiwanese would actually be okay with living under some kind of Chinese rule. But that might not be the operative question, right? The question might be, do you accept that versus destruction? Okay, well, that makes it changes the calculus a bit. And so for me, the issue is not that. I agree that the Taiwanese have many more cards to play in terms of getting the United States in and being of value to the U.S.-led order, as well as serving Japanese, Australian, all these other interests. The difficulty, however, is that our approach of strategic ambiguity means that Taiwan cannot adopt its most effective defense. Why invest all this in military spending if your entire approach is based on the idea that the U.S. is going to show up at some point, and you don't know the U.S. is going to actually show up?
Yeah.
Aren't you just antagonizing the Chinese? And wouldn't it be better to cut a deal with them so that you're, Hong Kong lights? I don't know what you want to call it.
But what
talk about Neville Chamberlain. That sounds vaguely World War II-esque. Yeah.
And so, I think the other thing is that when we think about how the rest of the region will respond, I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic. I think Japan would respond, Australia would, Philippines probably not. But I think the bigger question to me is not the strategic decision of does country A or B actually say yes or no. It's, are they operationally effective? Do they have plans? And I think this is where another hidden cost of strategic ambiguity shows up, because we in the U.S. are the linchpin to any sort of Taiwanese defense. If we don't say what we're going to do, nobody else can say what they're going to do. If I'm sitting in Tokyo and I ask DC, like, China launches a war, are you going to go? And they say, we're not sure. We may, depends on the circumstance. How can Japan plan for that?
Yeah.
Right? Should they be gearing up to send humanitarian missions? Should they be getting missiles ready? And if we in the U.S. are being kind of a little bit too cute by half about what we actually want, then they can't plan at all. I mean, I think this is a big difference that you see between Ukraine and Europe on the one hand, and Taiwan and potentially the United States and others. With Ukraine, when they started fighting back, everyone else was like, okay, we know what's going to happen. And when the U.S. started providing support, Europe said, yeah, we know what's going to happen. We can actually plan around that. Taiwan, ambiguity buys us their caution and uncertainty, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and I suspect that we view that ambiguity as continuing. At least it's vis-a-vis the U.S.'s stand and maybe lack of clarity on the issue. Rob, last word for you. How do you see all of this playing out?
So one, I would actually concede Raymond's point that strategic ambiguity is actually not in the best interest of the United States. It gets back to this point about signaling. And good signaling is proven time and again to pay off better, whether you're talking about economics or in most military strategy scenarios as well. Tit for tat, game theory, broad applications there. However, you have to deal with the hand you're dealt and not the hand you want. So I think in that sense, again, I would come back though to the same points. And that's the other thing about asymmetric preparedness is it's cost efficient. So if you can, reduce your defense budget, but increase your deterrence, that's a winning strategy. So that's one point. The other point is to Joel's question, the next 5 years. So Taiwan's defense ministry has, by the way, said it's next year that the mainland will be ready for an invasion. Now, ready for and actually prepared to act on are two different things. But they believe it will have the capability to, in its thinking, to invade Taiwan. And I would also point out that invade and occupy are two things. Secondly, the it's not so much an official Pentagon statement, unless Raymond has information to the contrary, but various senior serving and former military officials in the U.S. have indicated it's by 2027 that the PLA, People's Liberation Army, should be ready for an invasion. And then on top of all that, there's this general consensus that there's this window of opportunity that China has. It's basically over the next 10 years, right? And if it doesn't, strike within that, it's going to just kind of miss it because you've got an aging population, a slowing economy. I mean, the sorts of issues we were talking about at the beginning of the program get that much worse. So my base case is that, we've had a really weird status quo ever since, the KMT decided to relocate the Republic of China, which is what Taiwan is officially known as. So it's the other China, if you want to take that viewpoint. That's what it's officially known as. Whether you're pro-independence or you're KMT, DPP, whatever, it is the Republic of China. So this that itself just shows it's mired itself. Its constitution is totally ambiguous. It is part of the mainland by constitutional definition, and yet it's totally separate from the mainland by de facto administration. And I suspect with that in mind, actually that's the best way to allow the status quo to continue to play out. So that's base case. But then there is this possibility, whether it's a gray zone activities that get out of hand, or what I'm even more concerned about is all it takes, we've had a couple of incidents where U.S. ships sailing in the South China Seas had a couple of close calls. We had a U.S. spy plane, of course, land famously on Hainan, damaged, after an encounter with a Chinese PLA Air Force jet. So it's stuff like that could trigger something that would escalate. So I would say that is definitely a possibility. And the only thing, although I don't have it as my main expectation, Taiwan, the United States, surrounding countries should all prepare for that. And it's in their best interest to prepare to the maximum extent possible in a cost-efficient and sustainable manner.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation. We certainly live in interesting times. And we'll see how all of this unfolds and see where things actually progress and go to over the next 5 years to a decade. And of course, you'll hopefully be back to help guide us with your points of view. So thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Rob, for your expertise. And thank you for being a guest on the Feudal Future podcast.
The Feudal Future.